It is, did you know this? I think nearly every day is some national day these days. Have you noticed that? They've got a National Hot Dog Day and all that kind of stuff. But today is Grandparents' Day. How many grandparents have received a phone call already from a grandchild saying, Happy Grandparents' Day? I don't see any hands. Oh, I see somebody. Oh, two. Isn't that amazing? Two people. Take a lead there, young people. You might still have a cell phone. You could use it. Grandparents, what a phenomenon that really is. We grandparents probably get more excited about that than does any grandchild or any of our children, because it's just that special relationship. But when we study the Bible, we find that there is a connection that I think is worthy of us spending time talking about today. I call it generational Christianity. And if you want a subtitle for it that might make us understand exactly where we're going there, is it runs in families. The idea of Christianity and the view that we see when we look at the church, we realize, come to understand, often the whole concept of serving the Lord does run in families. You find it running through from generation to generation. And that seems to be what God had in mind, not just in the church, but if you go back to the Old Testament system under the law, where the Jews were the chosen people of God, he had an assumption almost that these people are going to stay and they're going to all be part of the system, and he gave a plan by which that should be a natural process. It was in teaching, it was in communicating, it was in keeping the information continuing from generation to generation, and the fellowship and the participation with each other going from generation to generation. That's one of the reasons why when Jesus came and began to speak about a change that was coming, whenever the apostles began to speak about the new covenant and the new system of grace, it was hard for the Jews to give it up, because they had Judaism running in their family for centuries and centuries, and this was all new because they had adopted, they had adapted, and they had assimilated that whole system because it had been handed down to them. Quite often, when we talk about inherited religion, we speak of that in a negative sense, because that would just mean that I've got my parents' religion because that is my parents' religion, or I've got my grandparents' religion because that was their religion, and that's not a healthy thing. Everybody ought to discover what truth is and right by his own study, but he ought to be taught many of those things by his parents and by his grandparents. If you go back into the book of Deuteronomy, when the law was given in chapter 5, God had already said in chapter 4 that the parents were to set up a system by which they would be teaching their children and their children's children, even for ages to come. You teach your children and you teach your children's children. After the law is given in chapter 5 and chapter 6, verse about 9 and 10, it goes back again to the fact that I want you to teach these things, all these rules I want you to teach to your sons and to your sons' sons. I want you essentially to be parenting for about 100-year period. If you think about it, whenever you bring a child into the world, and by the time he or she has developed into maturity and leaves the home and then starts to have a family of their own, and then those grandchildren eventually start to have families of their own, if you're still living, there's a sense in which you still are parenting. Your shadow of influence still is extending down through the family for about 100 years. And that causes generational Christianity whenever the proper teaching process has occurred. And when it does occur, there is a beautiful picture that exists. Sometimes you go to a congregation of God's people and you find that there's a large part of that church that is from one clan, you might say, from one family, because they have been part of the community, not moving away and being gone from it, and so they continue to contribute to it. And there's some beautiful pictures that exist in that way. It's like the New Testament had in mind whenever the Apostle Paul said, you parents, teach your children, bring them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord, urging that they be kept close to the Lord and faithful to Him always. In the Old Testament, there were times when they didn't follow what God said, and it fell out, you might say. My dad would have said the seed ran out. It no longer reproduced. And so things went bad, went south. The religious community lost its fervor, its influence, its effect on the young people as they were growing up. There's the sad story in the book of Judges that says that in those days there was no king, and everyone did as he saw fit. That's the last verse of the book of Judges. They had not had leadership properly, and people had not taught like they should. And yet, there you had Joshua that went before the day of the Judges. Joshua was a faithful man of God, called by God to take the place of Moses, who was the leader at the time they received the law. And that same system of you teach your children and teach your children's children was in effect. In the time of Joshua, the scripture says that all the people were still adherent to the teachings of God. But then the early part of Judges explains that another generation arose that knew not God. After Joshua and his contemporaries died, a generation grew up that did not know God, and they did not follow and worship Him properly. They hadn't been taught. And so it ceased to be a people who didn't perform idolatry, for instance, or who kept the moral system that God had established because somebody failed to communicate. But the picture can be beautiful when we are successful in it. When we understand that there's a message to be shared and there is a banner to be raised and to be held high because we are the children of God. I communicated this week with a couple of people to confirm my memory, and I actually learned some things that were new about them. I want to tell you just a bit about these two families, and I'm tempted to get into three or more, but let me tell you first about the family of Cecil and Ethel Brantley in Dallas, Texas. Now, Cecil came out of a family of people who all the Brantley brothers of his were members of the church, and I suppose that perhaps his parents were, but I'm going to pick up with Cecil and Ethel. They had 3 boys and 1 daughter. Of the 3 boys, 2 of them still are elders in the church and have been for many years. The 3rd boy has never been an elder or a deacon. He could have served in either office, but for all of his life, he's refused to serve in any office in the church. Do not think that he was an unfaithful son. He and his wife married when they were 15 or 16. They had 2 children of their own. They have adopted, as far as I remember, 5 additional children and raised them. And besides those 5 that they officially adopted, they have effectively raised and educated another 7 to 10. And they usually did so while living in a little frame house. And in the 1990s, he still was driving to work a 1963 model pickup and working as a fireman for the Dallas Fire Department and running a business and working like a slave and always giving away everything that he made. He's one of the best and most generous and giving men I've ever known. I hope he visits us someday and I can introduce you to another one of my heroes, Lynn Brantley, and his wife Jackie. The daughter, Jennifer, had, I don't know, several kids of her own. And then she started into the business of foster parenting. And through that, she got a lot of kids that came through. And she became very attached. And the short story for Jennifer is that when she was somewhere in the range, I don't know the exact age, but at the age that she was, let's say, 62 to 65 years old, she adopted a family of 7 children and still is raising 6 of those. One went bad and had to go back, but the rest she still is raising, and her age is probably now up in her 70s. These are the kinds of people that faithfully serve the Lord because they were raised by Ethel and Cecil, who started the congregation of the Lord's church under a shade tree on property they owned, and eventually gave the property in order that a church building could be built on it. The church was in existence for something less than 100 years and went out of business this year. They closed and sold the building. Generational Christianity works. You've heard me perhaps speak of my friend, the priest, who's been a friend of mine for a long time down in Texas. He's an unusual priest in that he has a wife and family, and he's an elder in the church. His name is Joe Priest, and I like to joke about him being a priest. I spoke with Joe and I asked some statistics in his case. Joe said, and this I didn't know, that his family had been members of the Lord's church since the 1880s. And that by this time, and counting himself and his son-in-law, he knows of 11 elders that have come from that original household and their offspring. And I know that Joe is an elder in church that now is boasting of having grown to where they have consistently had 300 or more people in attendance throughout the summer and now into the fall. And I asked him about a figure. I said, Joe, when that church assembles and you have 300 people, isn't it true that about 30 of those, or 10% of the total number, are in fact your offspring and your grandchildren and great-grandchildren? At first he said, no, it's 27. And later he called me back and said, Eloise, and I've talked about it some more, it is 30. When you realize that a clan of people are 10% of a faithful and growing church in the community where many of them live, you understand that generational Christianity is a good thing, that it does run in families. And the idea that may pop up here is, of course, how does that happen? It has to happen somewhere. You notice that I started in 2 places with this. I could start back with Joe's great-grandparents, or I could start with Joe. I could start with Cecil and Ethel and go forward from there. And if today you'd like to be a family like that, we could start here today with you. And you could be the ones who become the seed for a family and a generation after generation of faithful people who love the Lord. Churches are like that too. Churches parent and parents parent. Whenever it comes to the business of how do you parent, what's involved in parenting, we have to realize that it starts with providing physically for children, of course, for the whole household with shelter and clothing and food, but also socially. It involves the socialization process that it's called in the world of sociology, where you teach them what morality is and what kindness is, how you ought to treat your fellow man, how you ought to pay your debts, and those kinds of things that are consistent with living the Christian life. And you teach them spiritually by keeping them familiar with the Word of God. And you teach them spiritually by making sure that they understand that the church is the most important thing in the family, because it is tantamount to Jesus Christ. It's his body, and so it becomes important. You don't have those families and that ongoing faithfulness by teaching them that well, right now we got the state fair going on. That state fair is more important than coming to church. That ball games and other fun activities, which in themselves have nothing wrong with them, or fishing or motorcycling or whatever somebody likes to do, or going to football games on Sunday, that those things take precedent over the church. You don't build these families like we're talking about, putting those things ahead of the Lord's church. You parent in the point of emphasizing Jesus and his church and it being so very important. You love, and you demonstrate that love to those children in the household, and you teach that love and teach them to love other people, and you provide for them a safe place. In today's world, I think that concept of a safe place is more important than what we have known before. But our children need to see our homes as a safe place. There are lots of danger out in the world. It's just unknown what's going to happen any day. When any of us as an adult leave home going to work, or any child or teacher leaves home going to school, we don't know what's going to happen. When a homemaker leaves to go to buy the groceries, we don't know what's going to happen before we return. But by all means, while we know there are dangers in the world that may cause us even to feel like I need to carry to protect myself, I need to know that when I get home, that's a safe place. That my daddy, my mom, my family has a safe place. And I'm secure when I get there. I spent a period in Dallas preaching in a church where what I call my kids, the young people there, didn't have a safe place mostly. They lived in apartment buildings where there were shootings nearly every night and drug deals going on next door. And they actually never felt safe, and they went to schools where they were bullied and manipulated, and they never felt safe. One of the things we want most is to provide for them a safe place. They need to know that when we come home, Mom and Dad won't be arguing and fighting. There won't be some kind of thing that scares me or perhaps is in danger of hurting me. But churches need also to provide a safe place and be a safe place. And the kids need to know growing up that when we go to church, there's not going to be a fight. There's not going to be arguments, and there's not going to be people who are misbehaving and saying bad, cruel things to each other. If there's any place in the world that I want our young people to feel safe, and to be right here with us when we're together in God's family, because that's part of what the church provides. But as parents in the household, that safe place needs to be extended beyond school years. And those kids that you're raising need to understand that this is my safe place for as long as these parents live. I'll be welcome back. And if I go out in life and life dumps on me, some man beats me up, some husband, I get abused, mistreated, and unsure of myself, I can go home. It's my safe place. They love me there, and I'll always be welcome. That's one of the things that we try to do as a church, too, is to realize that when our young people leave, or even our new converts may leave us and go out, and the world may dump on them in every way. We want these over here, wherever they're scattered now, and wherever they're scattered outside the walls of this building from years before. We want to create an atmosphere in here that says you can always come back. You can go out and do what you do. You could go out and you could get hooked on drugs. You could go out and a young lady could become pregnant out of wedlock. You could go out and marry and it go bad. And we want you to understand, you come home. We'll be waiting for you in our safe place. You won't be condemned. We won't nod our head and say sin is okay, but we'll say you are, and we'll help you to rise up and overcome that. A church ought to be like parents in that way. And we're trying. We're providing youth ministry and nurturing and spiritual training. We're providing some fellowship in a circle that's good and right and wholesome for you. We hope you never need to be restored. But if you ever do, we want you coming home and not feeling like we're going to hit you, or we're going to yell at you, or we're going to condemn you, because we aren't. We certainly shouldn't. There are some hard parts in this whole thing. Parenting, generational Christianity, because sometimes children become belligerent. Sometimes they become rebellious, they become hard to manage, impossible to manage, and especially that's true for a mother alone at home. That happens many more times than we would wish today. Quite often, it's grandparents that are actually serving as the mentors in those cases. And the church and its leaders have trouble with that as well. When young people refuse to cooperate, it's hard to overcome. When they leave their family, they go out and marry outside the church, and sometimes they associate with people that aren't good for them, or they have in-laws that distract from their Christianity. And all those things are hard and difficult to deal with, to keep it going, to keep from the chain breaking and the continuing line of faithfulness not being broken. So what about the what ifs? What do you do if those circumstances that develop? You need to understand that when you've done your best, you can say, I've done my best, but they just won't. Everybody's got a choice and a mind of his own, and our children and our grandchildren have minds of their own and choices too. And so when they make the bad decisions and they go away, I recommend that we not condemn ourselves, that we not beat up on ourselves, that we not give up on prayer or hope. Cry when you want to, but continue. Continue to love them and to communicate with them in love as much as you are allowed to communicate with them. Keep the door open so they can understand that they are welcome to come home. Be supportive in all the ways that you can. But there's a line at which you have to draw. You do not compromise the truth. You don't say that religion that's not biblical is okay. You don't compromise the truth about Jesus and His church. You don't compromise your own conscience when you know what's right. You don't approve of what's wrong. You can love them without approving their lifestyle or what they've chosen to do. Don't compromise your conscience. Don't compromise the law. And don't support financially that which is inappropriate and will be destructive to them because of their habits or the lifestyle that they have developed. That's not easy at all. That's hard. That's tough love. But it's exercising the tough love on yourself, because the tendency that love calls for is to give. And we want to give. Dad, I need. Dad, I want. Dad, would you, can I, would you? And sometimes when one knows that this would be destructive, he has to say no. But you pray. You pray often. You always pray. You pray for prevention of this to begin with while they're young, while they're little, while they're still at home. Pray that they'll always be safe and they'll always be faithful. During their teen years, when they're about to move out, pray that they'll make good choices. Pray. You can't control what they're going to decide, but you can pray, and maybe the master will control it in his way. And as a family, you pray all the time. Let them hear their name in your prayers. It means a lot. At least, I think it would. I think it would. Because I never heard my name ever in a prayer at my house. I think, but I don't know. Pray. Let them know that you pray. Ultimately, we have to realize that everything does ultimately become a personal thing. And what we do and what happens in our lives becomes ultimately between us and God. And the obligation that we can have to our children and our grandchildren eventually kind of runs out if it's rejected. But if it's accepted, it never plays out. It continues always to be extended, to go on and on. And so when that individual stands before the judgment seat of Christ to give an account of all the things that he's done in the body, whether they be good or evil, the chances are good that he will have done good because you helped him know what was good and set the example that he could see that it really meant what you said. It was important enough for you to live that way yourself. In terms of service, in terms of faithfulness, in terms of relationships, and ultimately in terms of salvation. Because it's God who's someday going to ultimately decide salvation or not for the people that we love the most. So we influence all we can, as best we can, for as long as we can. And one final urging would be this. Don't ever jeopardize your own soul for the sake of someone who has an opportunity but just will not do the right thing. Don't compromise your relationship with the Lord because you love somebody else more than you love Him. but always put him first. And this morning you may need to come back to him if you drifted away. This morning you may need to become a Christian if you never have. If you believe in Jesus, you'll repent of sin, confessing his faith, your faith in him, to be baptized in his name for the remission of sins. He'll wash you clean. If you're subject to his invitation, he invites you while we stand and sing.